Hello there, and a very warm welcome to this week's quick tip. So in the past, I've been requested this a lot, and the topic is how to clone dust and hairs on top of objects to give your renders a little bit of a boost to look even more realistic. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about stuff like this here. You can see the sphere here has some hairs and dust on it. Of course, I have prepared other scenes too, so I do this with a lot of scenes of mine, just because when you take a photograph in reality, so especially for smaller scenes and camera captures in a macroscopic range, that's a great trick to enhance your realism and detail in your scene. So let's get started by opening up Cinema 4D. Let's go into the old layout here. Let's do this, because otherwise I would be lost. I'm still clinging to the old layout because I know it. So, and then go into top view and go to the spline tool. Now what I sometimes do is go to enable snapping and then enable grid snap, because it lets you snap to the grid as it says. So let's do something like this, for example. This will be one hair. Now if I measure that, let's go to point mode here and see it's like 2 centimeters wide. That's a bit wide for a small hair. But let's leave it like this for now. And what I also do is go and set the type to B-spline here. And the adaptiveness to uniform usually. And then I'll play around with that later. So let's make this hair real quick, finish it. Maybe we want to make it a bit asymmetrical by moving that up maybe to here. And then we are going to get an end side. This has to be a lot smaller, so something like that. And then we do a sweep and put the end side in here. And now you can see we have sort of a hair. It's kind of thin, so let's make this a little bit bigger, something like that. And usually hairs are tapered towards the edges here, so let's do this by going into the sweep and into the details here. And you can have the scale then adjust to something more like this maybe. Now, I'm usually a perfectionist here and trying to get my knots laid out very nicely. But since this is a quick tip, you can do that on your own and try that. But yeah, let's go with a little bit of a broader mid section here. But something like this is what I am going for. Now, as this hair is really small in the end, we want to make sure to have as few polygons as possible, because we don't need that much polygons if we are seeing the hair just a few pixels across. So what you could do is go into the end side and take this down to maybe 4 or something like that. And then make sure it still looks rounded. You can do that by going into the sweep and then here into the fong and make it bigger than 90, so maybe make it 100. So it still looks round, but it has very few polygons. And we can do the same here for the spline by reducing those points, so we get fewer polygons still. So this is our first hair. Let's make a second one with the same technique. So I'm just going to copy that. And because I'm lazy, I'm just stealing that hair here and then going back to snapping and moving stuff around so I get some new interesting shape, something like that maybe. And you can do as many as you like, but usually you don't need as many because we are randomizing the scale and stuff like that, so you won't notice them repeating all over again. Now another thing you want to take care of maybe is the symmetry. So right now our hairs are flat and that might not be too realistic, so we can go into the side or top view and then move points out to the side to get a 3-dimensional shape, which makes the overall appearance a lot more realistic. So maybe take this and move it into the plus direction, so something like that. Yeah, that looks good. Last but not least, we need a dust speckle, and I'm really lazy and just going about and take a sphere here. Obviously that is much too large, so let's make it smaller. Usually the speckles are really tiny, so let's make it even more small, like this. And if we go to poly mode, this is not the polygon layout I want to do. Usually I'm going with, I'm in isopath right now, so let's go to wireframe to see the sphere layout. So usually I'm going with hexahedron and make this very small, not a cube, but like this. So we have a spherical object. Also make sure the Fong is set to a higher number so it appears round if we turn off the mesh again. So the shading is at least appearing round. Okay, maybe it's a bit too small. Let's make it a tad bigger, 0.3 or maybe 0.5. Yeah, that's okay. So now that we've made our dust objects, let's actually talk about how we are going to distribute them over our objects. In Cinema 4D, there are two methods you can use to do that. So one is the native method of Mograph with the cloner, and the other method is the Octane method with the Octane Scatter. With our final result, we are going to use the Mograph method, but let's go over the scatter method real quick. So I'm making a scatter object here and moving all the objects that need to be scattered inside. This is how it works. It's the same as with Mograph. So having done that, we need a surface to distribute them upon. So let's create a polygon object here, polygon here. And let's drag the polygon inside of the scatter as a surface. So the first thing you see, and let's start rendering here, is that the method here is set to vertex. That means the objects are generated on the vertices of the surface. We want to use the surface of the polygon though, so let's set it to surface, and as easy as that, you get scattered objects on that. Now, one disadvantage of the Octane Scatter is that it's very prone to non-uniform polygon layouts. So let's demonstrate that real quick by going to the polygon and convert that to a polygon object. And let's make some cuts here, very narrow cuts right next to each other. Let's go there. Here we go, something like that. And something like that. Hopefully that will work. So if I turn on scatter again and actually increase the count to maybe the tenfold, you can see that now we are getting some pattern due to the unregular polygon distribution on the surface. And this can bite someone in the ass later on if we are talking about CAD models or SDS distributions that are not quite uniform. So my rule of thumb is, if you need millions upon millions of clones on static objects, I'm going with the Octane Scatter. If you have moving objects and want to generally have a bit more control over your clones, I would suggest going with the Mograph option. By the way, small addition, if you want to control your Octane Scatter nodes, you have the possibility to also use Effectors. So let's do this real quick by going to Mograph Effectors and use a random here. This will then be linked inside of the scatter, so let's do this. And then it will create its magic here. So let's go about, and instead of the position, let's use the rotation here and use a 360-degree offset. And now you can see we have made a mess of hairs here. Nice. Let's do actually the same thing with the Mograph Cloner. So let's hit back a couple of times until we are back to our polygon object, and then take out the objects here and delete the Octane Scatter. Instead, we want to create a cloner. Set the cloner to object mode instead of grid and apply the object here. And then we are going to get our objects and move them inside of the cloner. And that essentially gives us the same ground setup than we had before, with the small difference that the count is very low. And this is because the instance mode is set to instances. That means that Cinema 4D sees them as singular objects. I can show you that by maybe move that a little bit higher and then hit C on the cloner. And if I curl that open, you can see all those objects are real objects inside of Cinema 4D. Now what I want to do is go and hit the render instance or multi-instance. So as more you move up the chain, the less resources it will take. But with multi-instances, there are some disadvantages again. If you use them, they are not supported with motion blur inside of Octane. So if you have moving geometry that you want to clone something on and have motion blur, you need to have render instances. I'm going with render instances right now because they tend to be less buggy than multi-instances. Let's up the count again to maybe 5,000. And then you can see the distribution is a little bit different, but in essence it's the same what the Mograph Scatter has done. So to get them randomized, we can do essentially the same. So make sure the cloner is selected and go to Mograph, Effector, Random Effector. And then instead of the position, we want to affect the rotation and rotate them by 360 degrees randomly. And we get a very similar result than what we've got with the Octane Scatter. So now that we've done that, let's talk a bit about materials. Because we can't just let the hairs sit around with a standard material, can we? So this scene here is lit by a light on the opposite side here. So the scene is slightly backlit. And this is because the hairs usually are translucent a little bit. To create a translucent material, let's go with a diffuse. Because I found if you use reflective materials on such objects that are that complex, you gain a lot of render time, and usually using just a diffuse transmissive material is the right thing to do and looks almost as good. So let's do this by going into the diffuse, going into the transmission, and set the transmission to 1 for now. Actually also apply the material, so select all objects and hit apply. And we can see that something is already happening, but it's not a lot because we have to account for the energy distribution. Let me explain a little bit. So in the diffuse, our energy reflection, so light that is bounced off of the surface, is at 0.9, so 90%, which is really high. That means if light energy is hitting the object, 90% of the energy is reflected and only 10% is let through to be transmissive. So if we go down with our diffuse, more energy is preserved to be transmitted. So let's go down to a very low level, so such as 0. You can see now the update is not hitting, now it updated. Now you can see that all the light is transmitted through. This looks good from this side, but can look bad from the other side, because now the surface on the front is rather dark, because no light is actually reflected, which in real world is a certainty and should be accounted for. So what we are going to do is get a value higher than 0 in here, for example 0.25 or something like that. So we are having our hairs with a white reflection in that sense of a diffuse reflection, but still having a lot of translucency that light can shine through. Since I'm a fan of irregularities, let's actually use the random color to get some irregularities in our hair. So let's pipe that into our diffuse and the transmission to show you. So the random color is giving the objects, each clone, a random value between black and white. So some of the clones are black, some of them are gray values, and some of them are white. Since this is a little bit too extreme, we are going to use the gradient to map that to our liking. So let's use the gradient and bring that in and pipe that into our streams here. So for the transmission, we want to have a little bit of a lighter value range. So let's go to the black spot here and let's set it to 75. So we get a value from 75 to 100. And with the diffuse, we also don't want to have black, but it's okay to be on the darker side. So let's go from a value from 25 to a value of maybe 50. And now we have translucency and a little bit of variance in our clones here. So let's bring this tutorial to a close by actually applying those techniques to an object and not just to a plane. So I'll copy the whole cloner and the random effector to another scene. So I've already prepared my old keycap scene here. Paste that in here. Now, of course, the cloner needs its reference again, but instead of the plane, we will choose the one keycap here. So let's do this. Let's create a connection here by going to the cloner. There's another advantage of the cloner. It can deal with the SDS objects, while in the Octane Scatter, you would need to convert the SDS before you can apply it. So let's drag in the actual SDS object. And we can see our keycap is now full of big hairs, and this will look very funny if we render it now. So let's render that. Here we go. A ball of hairs here. It's not looking very realistic either. So what we need to do is make our hairs smaller. So you can do that by scaling each object down. But what we also could do is go to the cloner, select it again, go to the Mograph, go to the Effectors and add a plane effector. And the plane effector is moving our objects here, but what we want to do is instead to scale them down. So we want to use a uniform scale and maybe an absolute scale and scale them down by minus 0.8 or something. That looks a bit better, but they're still much too big. So let's go even smaller, 8.5, maybe 9.5. Here we go, that's more like it. Now we can see that we have some hairs on the object that are looking rather nice, but still there's a bit of uniformity here. And to break this up a little bit more, we can go into a random cloner here and also affect the scale next to our rotation. To do that, we are going to do exactly the same as we did in our plane effector. So uniform scale, absolute scale, and make this minus 0.99 maybe. So we have some really random small and bigger hairs here on the object. And you can see that it's already looking a little bit more realistic. Now, usually to avoid using up too much resources, I also have the object surface that's outside in a selection that we can now use in the cloner to get rid of all the clones that are inside of the object that we won't see anymore. So we are not using more resources than we need. So now that we've getting that, the only two things I want to adjust here is maybe the count. So it's a bit high with the 5000. So let's go back to maybe 2000 because less is more sometimes. So that looks even more realistic. Of course, you can pick up any macro photography and see how much dust is on objects usually, and then go off from there and replicate that. Maybe I also want to go inside of the hairs here and make them slightly smaller because they appear to be a bit thick. So let's go with 0.1 to make them a little bit thinner and therefore not show up that prominent in our render. And last but not least, if you have glass objects or transparent objects and the hair are sticking inside and you don't want that, you can also take advantage of priorities and just simply go to your hair object material and to common and set the priority to -1 or one step lower than the glass or transparent material you're putting them upon, and this will take care of the intersection. If you're not sure what priorities are, they are part of Nested Dielectrics, which I also made a video upon, so you can look that up in my quick tips and tutorials playlist on YouTube. And this concludes this week's tutorial, so if you have any ideas for future videos, write them down in the messages below, or just contact me on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I'm on a small vacation next week, so there won't be a tutorial unfortunately, but I'll be back in 2 weeks then. So have a nice time and happy cloning. Bye!